So, Tracey, thank you for doing this podcast. It's a pleasure to be able to sit down and talk with you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Tracey Brame, and I have I'll give you my long title, and then I'll kind of break it down. I'm the Associate Dean of Experiential Learning and Practice Preparation at Cooley Law School. So that means, a lot of administrative work at the management level of the school, but my favorite role at the school is that I'm the director of the Cooley Innocence Project. And we help Michigan inmates investigate claims of innocence.
I'm sorry, you help Michigan inmates what?
Inmates explore claims of innocence.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a lot there. What is that like, for one, and how overwhelming is that?
It's very overwhelming. So there are two innocence projects here in Michigan. There's ours, and then there's one at the University of Michigan. And we correspond with Michigan inmates who want help, right, with what they consider to be wrongful incarceration. Our clinic specializes in forensic and DNA work. So we take on cases involving DNA claims, right, and forensic claims. And so I guess our prototypical case might be a case in which we would test a piece of evidence from a case, right, to try to find a path to exoneration for our client, right, to show that he wasn't on the scene or that he wasn't, right, part of the crime or something like that. That's our specialty. It is incredibly rewarding work, right? But it is overwhelming. I think people underestimate the number of folks that are wrongly incarcerated here in the state and around the country. There are a lot of people in prison who shouldn't be there. And sifting through the number of people that write to us, right? Because obviously we get more inquiries, right, than we can handle, and not only the innocent folks write to us, right? So sifting through, those cases and finding cases that are good cases, quote unquote, both in the sense that there seems to be an innocent person, right, that we need to help, and that there's something that we can do to help them, right? It's a big task.
Right. Now, how many people would you say are wrongfully convicted? Do you just work on Michigan cases, or do you work on?
We just work on Michigan cases.
Okay, so how many people are wrongfully convicted in Michigan?
That's incredibly difficult, an incredibly difficult question to answer, because, like I said, there's so many more cases than any of us can get to. I can tell you, so for example, we work with the Wayne County Conviction Integrity Unit, which is an arm of the prosecutor's office that works on innocence cases as well, that examines old cases. And it's been a wonderful program, right? Because instead of fighting the prosecutor, we're now working alongside the prosecutor to kind of get to the truth of these cases. And in the couple of years that they've been up and running, Valerie Newman and her office, and that's just in Wayne County, Michigan, have their exonerations are in the low 30s, right? 33, 34 people just in a couple of years. Our office over the last, our office has been around for about 20 years, and we've had direct involvement in about 10 exonerations. And University of Michigan, I think, just celebrated its 20th, right? And some of those overlap, right? Some of those overlap, but just in, just off the top of my head, I can refer you to dozens of people, here just in this state that have been exonerated. And like I said, the number of folks who are still sitting in prison, it's just hard to know how many people are actually wrongfully convicted.
Now, what exactly leads to somebody being wrongfully convicted? Is it like negligence in the prosecuting process? What is it?
So there are a number of factors that lead to wrongful convictions, and people often think of wrongful convictions as kind of this nefarious conduct on behalf of the government, like planting evidence or sloppy investigations, et cetera. And that does happen, right? Certainly happens sometimes, and certainly before there was such thorough DNA testing and post-conviction investigation, it happened more than it does now. But there are also, right, other circumstances that might not necessarily be nefarious, right? That might not be purposeful. So one of the dynamics we see is that there's a lot of pressure on police departments to solve crime, right? And once they zero in on the suspect, sometimes, they start to engage in what we call a suspect-based investigation, as opposed to a broader investigation. That they might zero in on John Doe, and their investigation turns into, let's show that John Doe did this, right? And so, they're looking for pieces of the puzzle to put together to show that they did it, when, in actuality, right, it wasn't them. But they have narrowed their investigation, right, in that way. There are sometimes, false forensics that lead to wrongful convictions. We had a case where our client was convicted in part based on bite mark evidence, right? So bite mark on the victim matched his dental plate, right? And bite mark evidence has been shown to be unreliable, right, and specious. And so, those kind of things have led to wrongful convictions. People assume that, particularly in cases where there are confessions, for example, that, there's no way anybody would confess, right? They were actually innocent. But we found that there are coerced confessions, right? That people under dire circumstances will say just about anything to be able to go home, right? On a promise of mercy, right? They'll say just about anything. And again, sometimes they're browbeaten by horrible cops. Sometimes the police officers think they have the right person. They're just trying to get a confession.
Does ethics have anything to do with that? The way they do the interviews post like a murder or something, the way that they talk to the person who possibly committed the crime, is it the way they conduct their ethics around it?
Sometimes, right? Like I said, sometimes it's just, like I said, the police officer thinks that they have the right person, and they're trying to get the story. They're trying to get a dangerous person off the street. But if you think about, right, what any of us would do to try to get somebody to tell us something, right? The police officers use, and detectives use tricks, right? They use, they everything from, sleep deprivation to, kind of hours-long interrogations and things like that. And one of the things that we see is that in most states, including Michigan, police officers are allowed to tell a suspect something that is not necessarily true in order to get them to confess, right? Your buddy's in the other room. He's already confessed to this, right? He's already told you were involved, so you may as well confess, right? And that is not necessarily an illegal thing to do, right? We might think it's a tricky or unethical thing to do, but it's not necessarily an illegal thing to do. So the things that you would guess, right? Isolation from attorneys and from family members, coercive tactics, just, in general, false information about what they know about the crime. All of those things kind of go into people.
Wow. I didn't realize that was completely legal in Michigan. That's wild. Mm-hmm. That is really wild. My next question is, how often is there any recent cases where somebody was wrongfully convicted, or is this something that was kind of something of the past because of the lack of communication, the lack of media, and the media coverage, and the lack of technology?
So that's a great question. And certain types of wrongful convictions, right, have diminished somewhat. So, for example, one common type of wrongful conviction in the past were convictions in which Black men in particular, right, were convicted of raping white women. And part of the dynamic there is that we now know that eyewitness, right, identification is not always accurate, right? Not as accurate as we think it is. And in particular, cross-racial identification can be problematic, right? So we know a lot more about that than we knew 20, 30 years ago. And we have much better, again, DNA testing and technology than we did back then. So what we're starting to see now is that recognizing those identification issues up front and having more DNA testing at the front end of the case, right? Instead of doing DNA testing 15 years later and saying, oh my God, it wasn't him, have reduced the number of those kinds of cases, right? Wrongful convictions and those kind of sexual assault cases. But they still happen quite frequently, right? And disproportionately to people of color in just about every other, right? Every other realm. It's just tough. Like I said, if we think about the rate of error in just about anything, nothing that we do is foolproof. And when you're talking about something that's complex as a criminal investigation, right, with all of the kind of incentives, perverse incentives that they are in there to solve the crime, it's inevitable that people are going to get caught up, right? And so we have, cases that have been around for 30 years of people that were convicted, like you said, back when, we knew less than we know now, but we also have more recent convictions where they got the wrong person. And again, one of the good developments in Michigan is that we now have these conviction integrity units. I mentioned the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, but we also work with the State Attorney General, Dana Nessel. Her office has a conviction integrity unit as well. And there's now more of a recognition from the government that sometimes we get it wrong, right? Part of the problem in the past is that, we were kind of banging our heads against the wall when we said, hey, we think this person, right, might not have done what they were convicted of, and there was a reluctance on the part of the government, right, for whatever their reasons might be, to acknowledge that, right, to admit making a mistake, to admit that they might have the wrong person. But now, there's at least a movement where, prosecutors' offices are opening these divisions that actually acknowledge that mistakes do happen and are willing to investigate. So.
Now, when somebody's wrongfully convicted and they are finally released and they're finally out of prison, their life, is in front of them now outside of prison, do they have any sort of compensation? Is there anything that the government or maybe you guys would offer them, any services?
So again, so great question, and we've come a long way in that regard as well. So there is actually a Wrongful Incarceration Compensation Act here in Michigan that provides an avenue for wrongfully incarcerated individuals to seek compensation once they're released. And it's a relatively narrow path. There's, things that they have to prove. They have to show actual innocence, and they have to show, certain things in order to apply for that compensation. But they can get up to $50,000 per year of wrongful incarceration through that process. Formerly incarcerated folks also they'll file 1983 or civil rights actions against the entities that prosecuted them, that investigated the case and prosecuted them. So there's, obviously that legal avenue if they can show that there was wrongdoing on behalf of the investigating agency, right? Sometimes they seek compensation that way as well. So those are the two really kind of avenues for recompense, for compensation, right? To actually, try at least to make someone whole from a financial standpoint. There are more and more services also to help people once they get out. The Michigan Department of Corrections has been doing a better and better job. So when someone is paroled after serving a legitimate sentence, right, in the last 20, 25 years, there's been an advent of a lot of reentry services, recognizing that most Michigan inmates, most inmates in general, are not going to be in prison forever. So unless you got a life without parole sentence, right, you're going home one day. And there's a recognition that for that inmate's well-being as well as for the community, we need to try to prepare them to come home. And up until recently, you didn't see that same level of service for wrongfully incarcerated, right, individuals, because it's just a different process, right, than parolees. Now, again, now that there are more people coming home, right, with more folks working on these innocence cases, the Michigan Department of Corrections is doing more as they prepare people to go home and make sure that they have things that we take for granted, right, like an identification, right, card that they can use to open a bank account, right, to rent a house, things like that, employment services, mental health services, educational opportunities, et cetera. Our office, has relationships with people in the community that we try to connect our clients to as needed. Some folks come home and they have a very great support network, but their family has been, with them all along and has been waiting their return. We had an exoneree last year who his family came to the post-exoneration gathering in a party bus. There were that many people, right? But we have another client who's exonerated last year who had lost everyone. He had been in for 33 years and lost everyone. And so we, helped him get an apartment, all of those things. So it really it depends on what any given individual needs. And, like I said, Valerie Newman at the Conviction Integrity Unit in Wayne County does a lot to support wraparound services for folks once they're released as well.
That's really cool. And I think that's extremely important for people who are just getting out of prison. I work at General Motors, and I have a guy that works in my team that was just paroled. he had spent most of his life in prison. He was like, I think he's like 68 or 70 or something.
Wow.
And so like it's kind of cool to see how somebody who was in prison that long was able to get out of prison and then actually land a what would be considered a good paying job.
Exactly. And if you think about how much development, right, there is in your life, in your adulthood, right? So many of my clients spend their young adulthood. They maybe have been incarcerated when they were 19, 20 years old, and they're coming out at 40, 50, 60 years old. And all of those milestones, right, again, that we take for granted in the natural course of, adult development, they haven't had an opportunity to do. And so it's great if they have that support out there, that kind of safety net of a job and of support. And little things, using the cell phone technology that wasn't around, right, when they went in, just
Right.
a little bit of that we don't think about day to day.
Well, I think that the whole idea of people, like, because it used to be kind of the idea of if somebody went to prison, then they should be shunned from society for the rest of time. But in reality, they're going to be a part of society at one point. So we need to try to find a way to integrate them back in, and so that when they can be a part of society, they can be a productive member of society again, and of the community.
And that's how we would all want to be treated, right? Because every one of us, right, makes mistakes. Every one of us falls short. And we all hope that we can be forgiven and that we can move on. And the folks that we're talking about, certainly the innocent ones, but even folks that are, incarcerated that were not innocent, they made mistakes, and their mistakes happen to be of the criminal nature and landed them in prison, et cetera. But they still should be, right, treated better than the worst thing they've ever done, right? Like all of us should have an opportunity to show that we're better than the worst thing that we've ever done.
Right.
Because, none of us are perfect.
There's a couple people I've had on the podcast that, like one of them, you might have heard of, Good Time Makes Good Sense in Michigan.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yep. They've been on
credit.
Yep. Good credited time. Yeah, they've been on the podcast. And then I've also had, what's the other one? Can't remember, Nation something, or Nation Outside.
Nation Outside. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I can't remember their name right now. But I get text messages from them. I think it's called Nation Outside. Yeah. I think they do work specifically for people that are in prison and trying to reintegrate into society. Correct? Yes, absolutely. And we also have in Michigan, we have a great system in place where people can apply to expunge their criminal convictions once they have served their time and spent a certain amount of time, home, getting their life together, right? So they can apply to set their criminal history aside so that they're not, every time they look for a job, right, they don't have background checks coming up saying, felon, right? So we also have a great expungement statute here in Michigan that has evolved over the last 10 years to be relatively expansive. Just recognizing that, again, from a moral perspective, a second chance makes sense, but also from just a very practical and even business perspective, second chance makes sense, right? You need people who are going to be able to contribute to society and to the economy.
Now, is there any state in the United States that's doing it right? That's
a loaded question. You know what? I don't know how to answer that. That's an expansive question that I'd have to think more about.
Is there any state that is? Let's break it down. Is there any state that, as far as reintegrating people back into society, as far as offering mental health services, which state's doing it the best?
Right. You know what? I haven't done a statewide kind of that's actually a great project, and I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say I have a great project for you that I was just given. So I don't know the answer to that question. I can say again that Michigan is making inroads, and some of the states, to the extent that they are doing things well, they are encouraging wraparound services for people coming home. They are reinstating, right, the right to vote, et cetera, once people come home. They are, providing avenues for compensation, and things of that nature. So I'm not as up on what all the other states are doing. I'm more, kind of familiar with what Michigan is doing. And I can say, right, with guarded optimism that Michigan is moving in the right direction, even as we have a long way to go.
Well, I guess that gives people hope, right?
Mm-hmm. It gives people hope and people work to do, because we want to kind of, go with the momentum that we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how many cases has Cooley Law School been involved in releases?
So we have, directly 10 or so, and indirectly, so we have clients that we take on, right, formally, and then we have cases where we consult on the DNA portion of the case. So sometimes there might be a private attorney handling the case, or, the case might come to us in a different way, and we might just because we have expertise and we have a couple of grants that we work under that gives us funding for DNA testing. So some people work with us to handle that portion of the case. So 10 people directly, and again, our work is a little bit more narrow because it is science focused. So the cases that involve that kind of work, University of Michigan, for example, they have a higher rate of exoneration in part because they do a broader investigation of cases. They go knock on doors, they find old alibi witnesses, right? They, kind of reinvestigate the case in a way that we don't necessarily do. We say, hey, is there any evidence that might be worth testing, and what does that testing mean? But I have to say, and I keep putting these plugs in for the Conviction Integrity Unit, of those 10 people, I started here at the Cooley Innocence Project, beginning of 2020-ish. And just since I've been here and we've been working with Wayne County and the Attorney General's office, 3 of those 10 exonerees have come in the last 2 years, right? And we've been around for 20 years.
Wow.
So we've had, and I should say 4, really 4 of them, 1 on the Wayne County side, 3 on the Attorney General side, just in the last 2 years. So that's how forward thinking, at least Michigan has been. And so, like I said, there's a Conviction Integrity Unit at the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, at the Attorney General's Office, now at Oakland County, Macomb County, Washita County. So even at the county level, people are investing resources and recognizing the plight of folks who are sitting in prison, who shouldn't be there, who are waiting for somebody to help them.
What is the average cost to reopen up a case and to try to, reinvestigate? Right.
And so that depends on who's doing the work, for example. So for example, we're fortunate that we're housed in a law school. So a lot of the costs of the work is absorbed by my salary as director, and then we have a staff attorney and a managing attorney. We have secured a couple of grants, recently that support our work with the CIU, that have also given us an opportunity to hire a couple of other staff attorneys. And so you need attorneys, right? And attorneys, obviously, the best circumstances need to be paid, and they need to be paid a living wage. DNA testing is often expensive as well. So the testing piece of it is expensive. We work with the Michigan State Police Lab, which is, of course, a government lab that doesn't charge, but if there was initial work done in a case by the MSP, then we're going to send any subsequent work out to a private lab, which can cost thousands of dollars, right? So particularly in a case involving, but then there's expert fees, because while we know a lot about DNA, we're not scientists, and so we may identify issues and send evidence in for testing, but then we have to work with experts to interpret the results of those of that testing, which could cost thousands of dollars. So it could cost tens of thousands of dollars to truly and meaningfully investigate a case, particularly one that involves experts. And
wow,
it's expensive. And so, then I'm sorry, and I'll say we can only handle so many cases. If someone actually has to hire an attorney, that's a whole other expense that's added on.
Wow. So does the cost of reopening the case and reinvestigating, does that determine whether or not you guys will cover it, or if somebody else can cover it?
Well, no, we don't charge for our services as well at all. And again, fortunately, we have grants that help us pay for DNA testing. Or if, and before that, we would ask the courts, for resources for testing. So it doesn't really govern whether we take a case. What it does do, though, is it reduces the number of cases that we can handle at any given time, right? Because we only have so many people in our office, right? And we only have so much money. And the cases can take, we have clients that we had for years, right? Like one of our exonerees from last year, we were working on his case for 18 years. And, we had to wait for, sometimes you wait for the law to change. Sometimes you wait for technology to advance. Sometimes you wait for, politicians to change over, et cetera, because there's so many moving parts in in many of these cases. So these cases can go on for years. So finding that balance between making sure that we're thorough and we're not giving up on a case, right, that might take 10 years to break, but we're also getting to the backlog of people that are waiting. That's kind of a tricky proposition for us. And so fortunately, we have student help. We have our clinic, as well as University of Michigan. They draw on student volunteers, student interns to help investigate the cases, et cetera. So, the resource issue doesn't stop us from taking any individual case, but it definitely reduces the number of cases that it could be.
Yeah, I understand that. What is that moment like when somebody is finally freed and they have freedom? Like, what is that feeling like for you? Somebody who obviously is passionate about helping these people.
It is hard to describe a feeling that is better than that, right? So, being able to, we ceremoniously, when these cases are come to an end and we get a good result. And lately, like I said, we've been partnering with the CIU, and we'll go to court and we'll agree to dismiss charges, stipulate to dismiss charges against our client, and then we get to go and pick them up from whatever facility they're at, right? We might meet their families there and their friends and all these support folks. And my very first case here at the clinic, and I can't take much credit for the investigation of it because I had just gotten here, but it was a case that we were partnering with the AG's office, and one of my first tasks was to go to a facility and tell a client that he was going home. And I tell you, that was the absolute best feeling in the world. And I think, that's why there's so much support for this work, so much bipartisan support for this work, because who can't wrap their minds like that? Who can't, get excited about, people have differing feelings about people who have committed crimes, right? And who are currently incarcerated, and when they should come home or how they should be treated when they come home. But someone who was innocent, right? You're hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't get excited about them coming home. But it's a little bit tempered by, sometimes you step back and you realize, but they lost 25 years of their life, right? So as happy as we are, we're just so elated that you finally get to come home, right? That next day you wake up and you say, now they have to put these pieces back together of their life. And how do you, even with, the Wrongful Compensation Act, and even with resources and dollars that they might receive and community support, how do you make up for that 10, 15, 25 years, that they didn't have with their family, or freedom that they didn't have? And, like I said, that's where the kind of mental health piece comes in, and the kind of, recognizing that while we should be really, really happy to go and watch somebody walk out the prison gates, we should also be working very, very hard to prevent these convictions from happening in the first place, right? And devoting whatever resources that we can to handling as many of these cases as possible, so that people, because it is a job that is full of emotion, right? You mentioned the word, you used the word overwhelming at the top of the hour, and it really is an overwhelming system. So much so that we talk to our staff a lot about, secondary trauma and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because, we are working with folks that are dealing, again, if you can imagine being someone who knows in your heart that you didn't do what you were convicted, and I'm talking conviction for like first-degree murder, like you're in prison for life, and you did, like the psychological toll that takes on you, and we're working with these clients, and sometimes, we have a breakthrough and we're joyous and we're able to bring them home. Sometimes we agree, like in our heart, that we think this person is innocent, and for a variety of reasons, there might be nothing we could do. There's no evidence left to test. There's no, and so it is both joyous and heartbreaking, depending on the day. And, we just try our best to celebrate the victories, but to stay in touch with our clients, right? To make sure we all went to a basketball game over the break, to a Michigan State basketball game over break with some of our clients, to make sure that we stay in touch, and we let them know that, they are more than just some guy we got out of prison, but that, we try to welcome them back to community and society.
What kind of effect do you think people getting released from prison has on a community in their local communities?
Yeah, so particularly in smaller communities, finally having that loved one back, right? Like finally, so one of our exonerations from last year, he was convicted when his daughter was a baby, like a baby. Like I think they arrested him in the hospital room, like you know what I mean, after she was born. And so you know, he missed her growing up, and she's graduating from college, and she's just a wonderful young woman. So and you know, there were two brothers that were wrongfully convicted and released at the same time. And their mom had been their biggest advocate over the 25 years that they had been in. And the impact of their being able to rejoin their family has just been, again, immeasurable. You know, just you know, hard to explain. No matter how, you know, I'm a mom, right? A mom is a mom, and your baby could be 16 like mine or 47, right? That, you know, that's your baby, and watching her get her children right back, and that young woman to get her father back, it can be incredibly impactful. Unfortunately, you know, I talk about how joyous it is for someone to come home. You know, sometimes our clients still face stigma when they get home. And so even now with the cooperation of the prosecutor's office and the conviction integrity unit, there are still people sometimes in the community that like, I'm not so sure that person's innocent, or, you know what I mean? So they still have to overcome, you know, just kind of little slights and perceptions and biases that people who have been incarcerated face. So again, you know, it's one thing if you were there legitimately and you come home and now you have to deal with the stigma of being, you know, an ex-con or what, you know, or whatever antiquated terminology people use. But, you know, to have been innocent and spend all that time and still have to feel as though you have to explain yourself over and over again. So I think it can be a feeling of restoration for a community. I think it can be a healing, you know, for a community. But I think that's a great question because, you know, obviously the incarceration and the release affects the inmate and their family most, but it does also, and the community has to come to grips with the fact that, you know, they sent away, right, a member of that community wrongfully, right? Because the prosecutor's office, the police agencies are part of that community. So how do you feel? How does that, so one of the interesting dynamics is the relationship with the police departments in those communities, right? You know, it can't feel good as an officer, I imagine, right, to have this conviction that, you know, maybe you thought was solid from 10 years ago. Not everybody's looking at you because this person, you know what I mean? How does that affect relationships between police and the community? How do they continue to do their work? How do they, you know, come to grips with the fact that mistakes are made, but, you know, they still have to do their job? And so
that brings me to my next question. Obviously you work on the side of the law. I'm assuming you went to, you have a law degree, I'm assuming. Now, studying cases like this and seeing a lot of maybe some of the false accusations and some of the maybe some evidence was, you know, messed with at some point. Do you have any distrust for law enforcement? I mean, because there's like a huge, I mean, people are like more than ever, I guess, they doubt law enforcement and they don't trust them. So does that kind of alter your thinking towards?
So yeah, so as a lawyer, and particularly as an innocence lawyer, right, I have to be a trained and natural skeptic, right? So I have to, one of our jobs is to look at this case that was seemingly settled 10 years ago, right, and say, let us upend every assumption that was made 10 years ago. And that includes the police work that was done on it, right? Like, let's just turn everything upside down, and we're really investigating it new. So we have to naturally be cynical about the investigative work that was done. And in a lot of cases, you know, it's like, okay, yep, that was, you know, it kind of was what it was, and there's nothing that we could do. But in some cases, we do find, you know, evidence that wasn't turned over to important exculpatory evidence that wasn't turned over to the defense. You know, we find, you know, evidence that was tampered with or sketchy tactics used to extract confessions, et cetera. But I guess I'll say what I tell my son, right? I'm the mother of a young African-American young man, and I tell him all the time that police officers, investigating agencies are full of people, right? Just like we are all people, people trying to do a job. And I think most of those people are truly trying to do their job, right? They went into that profession, trying to make a positive impact on their community, to eliminate crime, or to make sure that there's justice served when there are crimes committed, et cetera. But just like in any other organization, right, there are people who cut corners, right, or who are in it for the wrong reason, or who over time, right, become jaded and think that everybody they encounter, well, if he didn't do this, he did something, right? You know what I mean? And I think that there's some perverse incentives in the system, right, that kind of lead to behavior sometimes that makes us cynical. So, for example, one of the factors that we see, we talked about factors of wrongful conviction. There are some convictions that are based in part on what we call jailhouse snitch testimony, right? Where you might have somebody that's in jail with someone that, all of a sudden is signing an affidavit and, come into the court to testify that, yeah, Johnny told me he also committed the crime, right? And then what you don't know is that this inmate was offered a reduced sentence, was given a plum, assignment, was, this, that, and other. So there's some incentives in the system, right, that just, that can't help but make one cynical. Right. I try my best, in working with law enforcement and working with the government, to give the same benefit of the doubt that I want given to me. But it's a line that we have to walk, because we have to ask the questions, right? And we have to make assumptions until we're proven wrong. But again, now that we have people from the government who are also working alongside of us, and if we can truly get to a place, where we have this cooperation, from investigating agencies, that, because, just as I see cops that are doing shady things, we have former police officers that are now investigators that are working with us, right? Trying to say, I saw some of the things that happened in my department. Let me help you, right? Try to track down an alibi witness in this case. So, so there's good and bad people in any, good and bad apples in any cart, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I had mentioned earlier, I work at General Motors, and so, like, it's not that serious of a job. Obviously, I'm not dealing with people's lives, but you see it in something so simple and something so easy where people don't care about their job. They'll like half-ass it or whatever, like they just don't care, because there's no consequences. They know they'll get away with it. And so it's like that in every field, and every
industry. Like that in every field. And that's a great point, but the stakes are so much higher, right? When you're an officer or when you're a prosecutor, and if you are phoning it in, if you're seeking this, if you're pursuing this conviction because it's an easy conviction and not because it's the right conviction, right? That all of a sudden that impacts somebody's life, right? You know what I mean? And right. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You got to have people who are dedicated to doing the job well, and who aren't just
and you have to deal with people having bad days. Like,
absolutely.
Whatever they have going on in their own personal life might affect the way they handle a case, or might affect the way they look at something, look at a situation.
Absolutely. Our own biases, right? The way that we look at the world, right? Like, and so I think that, we're never going to eliminate mistakes, right? Like mistakes are going to happen because people are human, and people are going to be wrong. We have arguments in our office, about the merit of the cases that come in front of us, right? Like none of us knows. My predecessor, the former director here, immediate former director, she has the saying that she likes to say, there was an old, I'm aging myself now, old hair dye commercial back in the day that the tagline was, only your hairdresser knows, right? Only your hairdresser knows your real color. And so my predecessor likes to say, only your hairdresser knows, right? If this person really is innocent, only if this person, mistakes will be made. And I think that the valuable work comes in when we recognize that and say, let's take another critical look. We have somebody who is insisting that they just weren't there that day, that it wasn't them, right? They're screaming for help, and maybe they're blowing smoke, right? Maybe they actually, but maybe, just maybe, can we entertain the possibility that they're innocent? And what does it mean to entertain the possibility? Can we take another look at it, right? And you mentioned before, people kind of cutting corners or phoning it in where they don't have consequences. And that's another, kind of issue in our field, is that police officers, for the most part, and prosecutors, they don't have to answer for their mistakes, right, in the same way that our clients do, right? You know what I mean? Like our clients are answering for those mistakes by being incarcerated for years. But even when it's found that, an officer has made a mistake, go on to the next case, right? That prosecutor goes on to the, you know what I mean, the next case, and there's a legal doctrine called qualified immunity that has roots in reason, right? Like we want our police officers and our prosecutors to be able to do their work without constantly being worried about being sued, right? Like, you know, I would try to stop this crime, but if I do it wrong, you know, I'm going to get sued.
Right.
But at the same time, it's become this shield, right, that has shielded them from consequences when they really even go overboard and violate constitutional rights, you know what I mean, or, you know, do really shoddy police work. So we really have to think about, you know, kind of what are the incentives and consequences when we're talking about the kind of investigations that are happening and the kind of work that's being done by these officers.
Yeah, absolutely. And also we have to think about mental health for them too, because a lot of the times they become jaded and shaded, and they become emotionally unstable because of a lot of the things that they have witnessed and during their career, not just outside things, like outside of their job, not, you know, just things from home, but the things that they witness on the job.
I would imagine it's a really hard job, you know what I mean? And again, I try to give the same grace and benefit of the doubt that I would want, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To kind of deal with the kind of, it's you know, it's a really hard job. They wake up in the morning and they go off and do their job and hope they're going to come home, you know, at night and try, and most of them try their best to do the right thing day to day.
What, I guess let's kind of go back to you a little bit. Why do you take so much interest in this, and what makes you want to do this for a living?
So, besides just being a bleeding heart, just in general, right? Like this kind of general answer. I got into this profession to help people. I was raised in inner city Detroit. I'm a first generation lawyer. I grew up in Detroit in the 70s and 80s. Back when, and to a certain extent it still is, it was really hard to raise African American kids in the inner city, right, without dealing with drugs and violence, et cetera. And I fortunately have incredible parents who navigated that so well and not only got me through high school, my brother and I, but through college, et cetera. And I was able to go to law school. When I went to law school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a prosecutor, actually, and for no other, because I really didn't know what lawyers. I didn't have a lot of lawyers in my family, so I didn't really know what lawyers did. I said, maybe I'll be a prosecutor and I'll fight crime. My first year of law school, we had a guest speaker with the University of Michigan, and we had a guest speaker by the name of Brian Stevenson. And I don't know if you've heard of him, but if you Google him, you know, he has his speeches are all over the web. You'll get. He wrote the book Just Mercy, and he's the subject of the book Just Mercy. And there was a movie, a motion picture a couple of years ago that was about his life. But he came to speak to us, and he is a Harvard-educated lawyer who dedicated his time, and talent, and treasure to representing inmates on Alabama's death row who couldn't afford counsel. And he came to speak to our class, and he was so eloquent and so passionate. I said, that's what I'm going to do. That is now my life, right? So I became an acolyte almost immediately, right? It fit very, you know, well in line with my sense of justice. You know, like I said, I grew up in inner city Detroit at the time of a lot of violence and drugs, and when I went to college and law school and started, you know, studying kind of the root causes and effects, right, of that dynamic. For me, like I think that there's definitely a role for good prosecutors and, you know, for crime prevention. Like I want my parents to be, they still live in the house I grew up in. I want them to be safe, et cetera. But I also recognize that so many of the young men that I grew up with, right, that their lives to too great of an extent were dictated by their zip code, right, by, you know, where they happen to be born or the resources that their families did or didn't have, the people that they fell in with, et cetera. And that even people who, you know, committed crimes sometimes, you know, again, were a function of their surroundings. And I wanted to impact that. As a Black woman, I wanted to, you know, make a positive difference in that regard. Most of our clients, so you know, I said earlier, people of color are disproportionately wrongfully convicted, right? So even though, you know, 12-13% of the population, over 40% of those can wrongfully convicted. And again, that's important to me, you know what I mean? And so that was a big driver of it. I'm also a law nerd. I just love the law. I was just telling a group of students last night, one of the things I love about the law is its potential to be this great equalizer, right? We as human beings are fallible. We have our own biases, surrounding all kinds of things, class, race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. We divide ourselves naturally, but the law tries to give us an even playing field, right? Tries to say no matter who you are, we're going to try to apply these principles in a way that makes sure that that justice is carried out. So that's what kind of steered me in this direction, and it's just really interesting work.
How long? I know you said you started your work with Cooley Law School in 2020, but how long have you been doing this work outside of college?
So I graduated from law school a long time ago in 1995, and after a couple of years stint with a judge, I became a public defender. So I was an appellate public defender. So I have been representing indigent people facing criminal sentences, since about 1997. And I took a break from that. I've been with Cooley Law School since 2006. So I took a break from that. I have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. And so while they were young, I was kind of boring college administrator kind of thing. I was the campus dean, and I was this, that. And so 2020, I kind of came full circle now that my kids are older, because I keep going back to your word overwhelming. It really is, if you do it well and lean into it, it is consuming work. And when my kids were little, I said, you know what, I didn't know if I had the emotional bandwidth, right, to do this and to raise, because I'm just as a personality about my kids as I am about the work. So now that they're more self-sufficient, right, one's, on his way to college soon, et cetera, I kind of return to this work.
My name is Lauren Harrington. I'm a real estate agent with Century 21, Lemac Realty. Whether you're looking to buy or sell your home, I can help. From the big cities to the small towns and anything in between, I can make your home buying dreams come true. Come join the Century 21 family. Contact me anytime at 989-534-6430 to begin the process. I look forward to hearing from you.
Sounded good. Now, you had mentioned, obviously, it's emotionally overwhelming also, but what kind of things do you do to kind of balance that out? Because I'm sure some days are exciting when somebody gets released from prison, but I'm sure other days could just be draining emotionally, especially when maybe there's a case where there's not enough evidence for you to try anymore and you can't get somebody out of prison. What is?
So this is what I tell students all the time. So, people think that the work is very sexy, and, and it is in the sense that, again, it's fun to get, it's fun to bring people home. But the vast majority of our days are tedious, right? Even boring sometimes, right? So when I tell students who say, I want to come work for the Innocence Project, I said, okay, do you want to take these 3 baker's boxes worth of papers and go through them one by one by one, looking for the needle in the haystack, looking for the smoking gun, knowing in that 9 out of the 10 cases that you touch, either the person is not innocent or you're not going to be able to do anything about it, et cetera. Do you want to deal with the client, the inmates, that we're, because, we have our clients, we have, that we're working with at any particular time where their cases are active, but we also have a laundry list of people that we communicate with because people write us all the time, and people who are, again, at the lowest point of their lives, who are agitated and frustrated, sometimes mentally unstable, et cetera, and sometimes they take that out on you. Are you willing to do that? Is that what you want to? So you're right, this job is intense, and it's both, I tell the students, it's both really, really detailed, reading every piece of paper, 1,400 pages, but it's also very broad, right? Trying to strategize about the best way, banging your head against the wall when you seem to have come to a dead end, and so it does, it takes its toll. You see it sometimes even among the staff. So one of the things that we do as a staff is that we try to do things together to make sure that we get to know each other, that we're bonding, that we are giving each other grace and mercy and supporting one another, both in the work and personally. Because again, our staff, they have lives outside of here, just like, right, everybody else. They have little kids, they have, other stresses in their lives. Right. And then I encourage, staff and students, and I try to walk this walk of making sure that you try your best to compartmentalize the work. And it's not always easy. Sometimes I go home and I'm just like, it's hard for me to kind of focus on dinner because I'm, trying to figure out a response to this prosecutor or whatever. But I try to make space to recharge, right? Whether that's spending time with my family, music is a big thing for me. So Stevie Wonder usually gets me, calms me down from any particular bad day. But it is, to your point, really, really important. When I worked for Brian, I talked about Brian Stevenson, coming to speak to my class. I had the opportunity to intern with him while I was in law school. And one of the things that he did was he poured a lot of resources into the representation of the clients, and he discouraged, and I won't say he discouraged people from making a career of it, but his office wasn't set up for people to be there, for lawyers to be there for decades, right? Because he realized, right, that it's the kind of job where sometimes you do it for a while and you need to take a, you know what I mean? Or you do it for a while and you need to do something else. You know what I mean? You do it for, because it is, like I said, if you do it well, it's really, really,
yeah, it's got to be extremely taxing on you. That's one thing I've realized over time is like things that you're passionate about, you focus your time even outside of work on those things. And eventually, even though you love doing it, it could be overwhelming and emotionally taxing and exhausting. Now, I had a question and it just slipped my mind. Oh yeah. Is there any cases that we should be paying attention to that you want like the listeners to kind of look up and maybe research?
So, I can't really talk about cases that are in process. I wish I could. But we actually discourage our clients from getting involved with media and all that kind of stuff, because again, some of the things that go into exoneration, there's the legal aspect of it, but there's also the political aspect of it, and this and that. So we want to, kind of make sure that all stays tight. But I would encourage listeners. There is University of Michigan there's a registry, a national registry of exoneration, and in that registry you will see just every kind of recent exoneration across the country, and it'll tell you a little bit about the person, about how and why they were convicted in the first place, what led to their release, et cetera, and that's really eye-opening. I would encourage people to, because again, I think people are sometimes their eyes are open when they realize how often or how easily this stuff happens. So just to encourage listeners to kind of read about it. Like I said, Just Mercy is a wonderful. It was a feature film, kind of a Hollywood film, and it's just a wonderful kind of example. And that case is a death penalty. It's about a death penalty case, but it's also about an innocence case. The man who was convicted was innocent, and it gives this kind of wonderful story of how he ended up in that situation and all the work that it took. And certainly, I know our office takes donations of resource and time from the public. Look for ways to support your local innocence organizations, or for people in your community that might be returning citizens, whether they're innocent or not. So just to kind of take steps to raise your own awareness about this issue and how we might impact it.
Yeah, I think it's super important to raise awareness, and I think that recently, within the last couple of years, there's been obviously Josh Dubin was on Rogan's podcast, and there's been some other people going on other podcasts to help bring awareness to a lot of the wrongfully convicted cases. And so would you say that within the last few years, there's been more attention surrounding those things?
Yes, and there's always, you always notice a spike when there is a kind of a sensational case about someone, there was Brian Banks, a football player who was, wrongfully convicted. So anytime you have a high profile case, that you see a spike in awareness. But what's been nice recently is, again, because of the movement, within prosecutors' offices and otherwise, there's been more exonerations. And so I think that people are becoming, it's becoming more part of the day-to-day consciousness of society, and not just this occasional thing where it's like, oh, wow, that, I can't believe that happened. It's more like, wow, another one. You know what I mean? I wonder who else needs help. So, again, that's been nice. And some of our exonerees, so, we have an exoneree named Kenneth Nixon, and he is just, I keep telling he's going to be mayor, governor, something one day. They've been doing just a phenomenal job of supporting each other, and trying to raise awareness both about how this has impacted them, but also about their brothers and sisters who are still, kind of awaiting help. So with social media and, all of those kind of things. There's just more, people like you who who host discussions like this. There's just more avenues, right, to have these discussions. And I always love, kind of talking to people who are exploring this for the first time. And they're like, wow, I just did not realize how deep this problem is. And so I never pass up an opportunity to talk about it.
Well, thank
more
you.
The merrier with respect to helping.
Yeah. Thank you again for sitting down and talking with me. I enjoy talking to people like you who are on the other side of it, but I've also sat down and talked to some like people that have been wrongfully convicted. I interviewed this lady. Her name was Elizabeth. I can't remember her last name, but she was one of the San Antonio Four. And there was, I think, a documentary on that as well. I think it was on like Hulu or Amazon. But she was 4 women were accused of like sexually like sodomizing a girl, and then I think it was like I can't remember. It was so long ago when I interviewed her. But yeah, they were wrongfully convicted and spent like 20 years in prison for it. And then it finally came out that that somebody had lied, and it was just horrific. It's horrific to hear those things, but it's amazing when you can sit down and see that person and see that they're not in prison, that they're living a decent life. And so I like to bring light to that. And
absolutely. People get in a second chance.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Well,
thank you so much. I so appreciate the discussion. I really do. It's just, first of all, it takes me, it's giving me a break from my banking box full of paper. It was an opportunity to talk at a higher level about it, so I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And thank you. Is there any links that you would want the audience to go visit? Maybe anything with your guys' organization specifically?
So I can send you, I can send to you, but once we get up, I'll send you a couple of links, but a link to our Innocence Project, just our website in general, that has some information. There's a national registry that I reference as well, but when we get off the line, I'll send you a couple of links that might be good, kind of overview sources of information. And there's an Innocence Network. There's actually a national network of innocence organizations that we're a part of, that does a lot with respect to support of innocence organizations and of exonerees. And we have a big conference every year, and cool. So I can send you a link to that as well. They're a good source of information.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you, Tracey. Thanks for doing this. It's been an honor.
Yeah, same here. Very nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you. All right. Bye.